I think one of the challenges, one of the things that holds a lot of us back is we believe that where we are today is where we will be forever. And we believe where somebody else is today is where they've been forever. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode. We talked about how long should your episodes be. So if that is a question that is yet to be answered for you, make sure you go back and listen to that episode. Today, for episode number 87, one thing you need to hear about comparison. Comparison is something I have talked about a lot on our other podcast, Next Level University, because I know that's something we all, unfortunately, tend to struggle with. Let me preface all of this in this entire episode. If my voice sounds off, if I sound less energetic, any of those things, it is currently 7:29 in the morning as the time of recording this. I was under the weather a little bit yesterday, so I was unable to record a day ahead of launch like I usually do. So this is a same day recording. So if I seem off, that is why. I do feel a little bit better, but it's early, so my voice isn't really warmed up. Okay, all that is good, done. Let's get into the good stuff. All right, one thing you need to hear about comparison. I said this to somebody yesterday. Shout out to Miles. I had a podcast breakthrough session with someone who listens to PGU. And I said, how do you think you're doing? You're 30-something episodes in, or maybe 26, 28 episodes in. How do you think you're doing? And this person said, well, I think I only have X amount of downloads. And I said, oh, okay. What do you mean by you think you only have? Or you only have? What does that mean? Because going back to an episode we did a while ago, the 3 most common things that stop people from winning in podcasting, it's just misaligned time perspective. That's 1. It's misaligned expectations. That's 2. And it's misaligned approach. That's 3. I would argue that if you think, let's say you have 3,000 downloads and you're 30 episodes in, you're getting an average of 100 downloads, listens per episode. You're ahead of the curve. It just doesn't feel like it. The expectations are throwing you off. The expectations of I should have more listens than I do might be throwing you off. And if you don't have accurate expectations, everything else gets thrown off. So one thing you need to hear about comparison, if you're comparing where you are today to where somebody is 10 years ahead of you, you are making a massive, massive, massive mistake. When I was going on a bunch of podcasts, which I'm doing less of now because I'm working inside the business and doing different things, but one of the most common things I would hear, people would say, well, I know I'm not where you are yet, or I'm only on episode 15. I know you're 1,500 in, or whatever. And the thing I would always say is, thank you. I appreciate that compliment, if it was a compliment, but don't compare where you are today to where I am now. Compare where you are today to where I was where you are today, because that's the only real way to compare. So what I said to this person on the podcast breakthrough session the other day was, I know it might feel like you're behind, but what if I told you you have 3 times the amount of listens we had and you're half as far in? You're only a half a year in. We had 1,054 or 1,000 and something in our first year. So you're already ahead of where we were. I know it doesn't seem like it, but that's your expectations, not necessarily reality. The expectations hold us back because more often than not, we think we should be more successful than we are. Imagine if it was the other way. Imagine if you were way more successful than you thought you should be. That would be a very interesting place to live. From what I've seen, most people aren't there. Most people are on the other end. That's the thing you need to know about comparison. If you just tuned into this podcast and you had no idea that I had another podcast and I've been on X amount of podcasts and I've coached X amount of listeners and blah, 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 all that stuff. And you hear me talk about how I do this for a living and I do this full time and I make more money as a podcaster and as a business owner in the space than I've ever made in my entire life, you might feel bad about where you are. But if you said, Kev, how long have you been doing this for? What have you studied? What has the journey been like? I've been doing this full time since 2018. But in 2018, when I started doing this full time, I was $30,000 in credit card debt. I couldn't afford to get my girlfriend, now wife, Christmas presents. My car broke down and I couldn't afford to get it fixed. I was sent to collections for my car insurance. If you're your first year of doing this maybe full time, I know that's probably a very select number of you, and you're actually making money, you're doing better than I did. If you're a year in and you have more than 1,000 downloads, you're doing better than I did. Even if you don't, you probably have more knowledge than I did at the time because there's more knowledge available now. I don't know. It's weird. I feel like we compare ourselves almost to feel bad. We compare ourselves so we can feel like we're behind. When in reality, and I said this to Miles yesterday, I said one of my favorite parts about the podcast breakthrough session is sometimes the most powerful thing I teach someone is you're actually further ahead than you think. That is so empowering. It's so empowering to think you're losing the race and then realize you're actually in the lead. That's why you haven't seen someone for a while. Because it changes the way you do things. Maybe you get a momentary burst of motivation and you're able to do something different, or maybe it helps you plan things in a different way. That's really my focus for today's episode. The thing that I believe we all need to hear about comparison is the people that you're comparing to are probably 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead of you. And if you are able to really sit with that and then maybe turn it around and say, okay, what's something I've been doing for 10 years that if somebody just started today, they would feel really, really behind. I'm 34, I think. Yeah, I'm 34. I've been driving since I was 16 and a half. That's when you can start practicing in the US. So what is that? 18 years? I've been driving for 18 years. Imagine somebody who is 16 years old who is driving for the first time is driving with me. They might say, there's no way I could ever drive like you. Of course you could. You just need as many reps as I have. There's no reason you can't improve as a podcaster. There's no reason you can't make money in the long term as a podcaster. But it has to be with an aligned comparison. That's all.
Next Level University and Kevin is exactly where you need to be if you're a podcaster. When I first started out just a few months ago, I had no clue on the direction I was going. I was getting hustled by another company that was giving me not even close to the value that Kevin and Next Level U was giving me. They literally changed the trajectory of my podcast, have helped me out tremendously. They understand the clients. I promise you, you will not go wrong with dealing with Kevin and Next Level U. I'll see you there.
And I like to say this too. A lot of people will say, I get a lot of compliments and I'm very, very grateful. I appreciate that very much. Usually you're really good at speaking or you have great stories, whatever it may be. I'm grateful for all of those. But I say, but what if I'm not as good as I should be for where I am? Wouldn't you expect that you would be very, very, very good at what you do if you had done it 2,500 times or at least 2,000 times? If you had done 2,000 haircuts, you'd probably be pretty good at cutting hair. If you had done 2,000 cases as a lawyer, you'd probably be a pretty good lawyer. If you had done 2,000 books, imagine if you had written 2,000 books, you would probably be the best in the world at writing books. 2,000 speeches, 2,000 coaching calls, 2,000 podcast episodes. So that is another important thing to look at is, yeah, where you are today is where you are today. But where somebody is today is not necessarily where they were compared to where you are. One of my favorite quotes is, I think one of the challenges, one of the things that holds a lot of us back is we believe that where we are today is where we will be forever. And we believe where somebody else is today is where they've been forever. I would say right now, Taylor Swift is probably one of the most famous people on the planet. Maybe There's soccer players that are probably more well-known. Soccer's a very, very, very big sport. But if you landed on this earth today and you saw Taylor Swift and you were a musician, you might be inspired. And you might say, my goodness, I'd love to get there one day. Or you might compare yourself and say, well, I just played a show and there was 18 people there. Taylor Swift just played a show and there was 80,000 people there. But Taylor Swift's probably been doing this for 15 years. I don't know how old she is, but I'm more than that. She's probably been doing this for 20 years. Compare your version of today to what somebody else's version of your today is. So if you've been doing it for a year, if you're going to compare, check on where somebody else was a year in. I think that's the only way to do it because we just lose sight of it. Walmart's one of the biggest companies on the planet. I think it took them 7 years before they opened their second store. 7 years. I think it was. And I think it was like another, I don't know. It was a good amount until they opened another store. But now they're one of the biggest brands on the planet, one of the biggest businesses. There's Walmart everywhere. But we only know that because that's the time we live in. We don't know what it was like. I don't know what it was like when Walmart first started. Same for you. And here's the last thing I would say. The beautiful thing about when people make it is they tell you about how hard it was before they made it. You might just be in that hard. You might be in that thing that I talked about where I couldn't afford to fix my car. I couldn't afford Christmas presents. I got sent to collections. I was $30,000 in credit card debt. That might be where you are right now. I resonate with that because I've been there. And if you're a year in or 2 years in or 3 years in, I completely understand. We didn't make money. I personally didn't make money from the podcast until I think probably 2.5 years in. So we're talking at least 100 episodes. And then it was, I'm so broke, I need to find a way to make money. And that's when I started coaching. And I started coaching for $50 an hour. That's where I started. So don't feel bad if you haven't got there yet. And I would say all things considered, we were probably a little bit ahead of the curve because my business partner understands business at a very deep level. So he had understandings that I didn't. So even that's a dangerous game if you compare, because if you only listen to this podcast and you've never listened to Next Level University, you might assume I've done all this myself. I have an amazing business partner who is a genius and knows so much about business. And him and I have been learning from each other and teaching each other different things for the last 6 years. And I've talked to this gentleman, Alan, every single day for the last 6 years, 7 years pretty much, 2017. So that's another important thing. You're comparing to what you're seeing. You're not comparing to the process that took place in order for the creation of what you're seeing. So if I could sum this up into one sentence, because I know I said a lot of things in this episode, and I feel fired up. 7:40 in the morning. I'm fired up. Maybe I got to start doing these earlier. Don't compare yourself and where you are today to someone who is 10 years ahead of you, unless it inspires you. But if it feels more constricting than inspiring, it's probably not doing you any good. That is what I would say. You can compare yourself to where you were yesterday, last month, last year. That's always good. As long as your self-esteem and self-worth and self-belief can handle that. But that's a really good, okay, this is my second year podcasting. Last year we had 1,000 downloads. This year we had 4,000 downloads. All right, cool. We 4x'd. Well, if that continues, next year we'll have 16,000. Ooh, okay. And then we'll have 64,000. Okay. And then we'll have whatever, 64 times 4 is 256. That's how things happen. But for most of us, it's not going to be we do a year of podcasting and we have 1,000 listens, and then the next year we have 1 million. I don't want to rain on any parades. I want to make sure I help you create aligned expectations. That's the difference. I don't think there is a hack. I don't think there is a cheat code. Most of us aren't going to blow up and go viral. I would just rather say that. That way we can set our expectations accordingly. I'm most likely never going to go viral. It most likely will never happen. That's okay. Because we're preparing for that not to happen. Where I know a lot of people, unfortunately, are preparing for that to happen. So if and when it never happens, they end up in a lot of trouble. And I just don't want that to be you. I really, really, really don't. I realize that this podcast and what I talk about on this podcast isn't always sexy, but from what I've done and what I've coached and what I've seen and what I've learned and what I've experienced and what's worked and what hasn't, I'm trying to teach the things that I wish I knew that have been the most valuable. So that is always my promise to you. I don't like hacks. I don't like cheat codes. I don't really think they exist. I've seen people try them and they just don't really work. And I've seen people get really lucky at what they're doing and then that's what they teach, but it doesn't work for everybody. So I want to make sure I deliver as much value consistently on different topics and all that happy jazz. All right. If you are like Miles and you've been listening to this and saying, well, I don't know how to implement what Kev's talking about. I don't really know what my business strategy would be. I don't know where I am in the grand scheme of things. Am I ahead of where I think? Am I behind where I think? I don't really know. And you want to hop on a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session, let's do it. I will have the link in the show notes. Again, Miles said this yesterday. He said, Kev, this was super, super valuable. I really, really appreciate you doing this. And I said, absolutely, man. I appreciate you listening to the podcast. And I get to hop on the Zoom machine with podcasters and talk about podcasting. At one point, that was quite literally a dream for me. So I'm always honored to have that opportunity. And my goal is to deliver as much value as humanly possible. All right. Next week for episode number 88, we're going to talk a little bit about money. And a lesson that I've really been learning with one client particularly, who is very, very good at what they do and very, very credentialed at what they do, but they made a common mistake when it came to monetizing their podcast/business. I'll make sure it connects to podcasting. And I think a lot of us, I've seen this many times with certain people. So I want to talk about that to hopefully help you avoid that in the future. As always, I hope you have the opportunity to do an early morning recording and it feels great, or a late evening recording and it feels great. I hope if you have a Facebook group, the engagement is high. I hope you're not too thrown off by Instagram and how it kind of slowed down and seems like engagement is harder and harder to get by the day. I hope you're testing out new things. I hope you're getting outside your comfort zone. And most of all, I hope you are growing as a podcaster. Until next week, keep on crushing it. Keep on podcasting, and I will talk to you